Hi, I'm Ben Cowles, and welcome to the third episode of the Morning Star's new YouTube interview series. So, with Donald Trump back in the White House and with Labour copying Reform's homework, we thought it was a good idea to speak with Sabby Dhalu from Stand Up to Racism. We're going to talk about all of that. We will also talk about Labour's anti-migrant rhetoric and the far-right riots that happened across Britain last year. Okay, Sabby, are you ready?
I'm ready.
Excellent. So, first of all, I think everyone listening is probably going to know about Stand Up to Racism, but just in case they don't, could you tell us about the organisation you work for?
Yeah, so Stand Up to Racism was formed approximately just under 12 years ago. And basically it was the coming together of Unite Against Fascism, which was formed almost 2 decades ago to campaign against the British National Party, and then after that other fascist organisations like the English Defence League. And Stand Up to Racism was really set up in a period where we had defeated the British National Party electoral threat, and we'd actually pushed back that recent wave at the time of English Defence League demonstrations led by Tommy Robinson. I think at the time Tommy Robinson was hoping to build off of the attack on Lee Rigby, which obviously, Lee Rigby was murdered in southeast London, and there was this fear that that would then spark a whole wave of Islamophobia, and English Defence League demonstrations, they would really build and grow. But actually we did a good job of mobilising against them and pushing them back. And so in 2013 that took place, and then we thought, well, we could have put our feet up, but we didn't do that. So we thought, actually, what we should do is do something about all this, the racist climate and the Islamophobic climate that has actually allowed groups like the English Defence League at the time, led by Tommy Robinson, and the BNP previously, to actually grow. So if you cast your mind back to 2013, it was a period sort of just before the EU referendum. You had people like Nigel Farage that were really kind of growing in popularity and support, and really ramping up the anti-migrant rhetoric. And then sadly, you had mainstream political parties, so David Cameron was Prime Minister at the time, conceding to that agenda, but also, sadly, Ed Miliband, who was leader of the Labour Party at the time, was also conceding to that anti-immigrant agenda. And I remember a lot of people saying, they just watch TV and they just feel like throwing something at it because they're just so fed up of the kind of anti-EU migrant rhetoric that was going on. Because I think wherever you thought about Brexit and, the EU, I think a lot of people could unite against the racism that was being directed at migrants at the time. And so we thought, we sort of joined forces with Diane Abbott MP and the TUC, and we called a demonstration marking UN Anti-Racism Day. And it was so good because for the first time in almost over a decade, I'd seen all these people that were working in the refugee and sort of migrant sector that I hadn't seen for such a long time, that were just so relieved that someone was doing something to push back against all of that racism. So Stand Up to Racism was born out of that call, actually, for an anti-racist demonstration, a kind of catch-all anti-racist demonstration, that was challenging Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, as well as pushing back against the anti-migrant, anti-refugee rhetoric at the time. So the first UN Anti-Racism Day demo we called was in 2014, and there were demos in Glasgow and Cardiff as well in Britain, and actually it was part of an international day of action against racism. So there, and it's you've had an international day of action ever since then. So Stand Up to Racism was born out of that, really.
And I was just thinking while you were talking then that it's quite sad how you said, at the time, at 2013, 2014, David Cameron was accommodating to the sort of far-right rhetoric. Now we have a Labour government in power, and they're doing the same, right? I think. Could you give us your sort of assessment of the Labour government so far in terms of anti-racism?
I think there's room for improvement. I think that a reasonably good job was done in terms of responding to the riots. I think the sort of swift, convictions and sentencing was good and helpful at the time. What I thought was weak at the time was calling out the Islamophobia and actually tackling that head on, because it was pretty horrific. You had mosques, they were, very much in the firing line and a key target of the fascist and racist riots, but obviously not uniquely. Anyone black or anyone that looked visibly, different, non-white, were targeted. So yeah, I thought they were weak on calling out the Islamophobia. I think they needed to tackle that head on. And I think that, I didn't agree with Starmer meeting Giorgia Meloni and, discussing some possible offshore, immigration and asylum processing centre, which is pretty much exactly the same as the Rwanda scheme. Well, what's the point in scrapping the Rwanda scheme if you're just going to replace it with something similar? I know there are human rights issues in Rwanda, but, I think most people just don't really see the feasibility and the viability of an offshore processing centre. So I definitely didn't agree with, meeting, fascist Giorgia Meloni. And then this recent wave of filming deportations of migrants and filming raids on nail salons and car washes and that sort of thing. I just think it's, to be honest with you, I think they're trying to respond to people voting for Reform UK, because obviously that's a massive threat, with a recent electoral calculus poll of polls showing Nigel Farage and Reform UK in the lead. And that's not the first poll. There's been several polls that put Reform UK in the lead, but also the largest share of the party, but also, if replicated in general election, would give them the most seats in Parliament as well. And something like, there'd be like 140 seats short of a majority. I mean, that is pretty shocking, and that we're in a new period, we're in a new epoch where a party to the right of the Conservative Party, a far-right party that it basically mobilises a vote on the basis of racism, is actually in first place in the polls. And we're only 8 months into a Labour government. Where's the honeymoon? So I think Labour's trying to respond to that, but actually it's a big mistake, because every single, study or examination of social democratic parties in government pursuing this sort of agenda shows that it has the exact opposite effect, because what you're doing is conceding to that agenda. I mean, nobody votes Labour to be tough on immigration. I don't care what you say or what you think, right? Why would you vote Labour if you wanted to be, tough on immigration and ramp up deportations, when you've got Reform UK and Nigel Farage and the Conservative Party if, you're not quite comfortable with, a party that's essentially far right? You wouldn't vote Labour. People don't vote Labour for that. People vote Labour to make them better off, basically. That's why people vote Labour. And actually, most Labour voters are generally quite anti-racist. And, I would say most Labour voters want a kind of human rights approach to refugee and asylum rights, and probably agree with, safe passage for asylum seekers, because there's nothing illegal in crossing the channel in a small boat and then seeking asylum and submitting an application for asylum. That's not illegal. You're perfectly entitled to do that, So, and I think most Labour voters agree with that. So I think Labour's approach is fundamentally politically wrong, because Labour shouldn't concede to what is essentially a racist agenda like that. But also, from their own point of view, from the point of view of self-interest and self-preservation of the Labour Party, it's not going to win them any votes. They're not going to gain a single vote out of it. They're just probably actually, giving more votes to Reform UK, because the more attention they're drawing to, deportations of, refugees and, that sort of thing. They're just drawing attention to that issue, which actually Reform UK and Nigel Farage would outperform them on. So it's wrong morally, and it's wrong actually from the point of view of actually mobilising votes for Labour. I don't think is going to work, and the polls are reflecting that. So I would urge Labour to shift course on that and, champion a more human rights-based approach. I mean, no one's expecting the Labour government to have an open borders policy, So I think everyone understands that. But I think, championing the right of people that are crossing the channel who are dying, and it is tragic, the amount of people. It's worse than tragic, because it's deliberate policy, because that could easily be stopped. So it's pretty horrific that all these people are drowning and a Labour government isn't simply allowing safe passage, for those people just to simply claim asylum. We allowed Ukrainian refugees to seek asylum here. We should be doing the same for those crossing the channel and risking their lives. And also I think Labour should be, championing our diverse and multicultural society and saying, Britain's a nation built on waves of immigration, from the Huguenots to, Jewish immigrants to Irish immigrants and to, more recent immigrants in the post-war period. They've all contributed massively to our economy, to our society, and also culturally in ways that we just take for granted. What's your favourite food? It's probably not going to be something traditionally English. What is traditional English food anyway?
Yeah, people think that fish and chips is English, but
it's not English. Yeah.
It came with Jewish refugees from Russia, I think.
Yeah,
exactly. Eastern Europe. Yeah, absolutely. Couldn't agree more. It's really interesting, the Labour's tactic, and it's interesting in a terrible way. It's like they're trying to, I think they're copying Reform's homework and they're trying to win them over. But I just think, like you said, it's such a stupid tactic. I think they need to stand up and defend, like you were saying, what they're doing. They need to completely change their rhetoric, I think. And because I think a lot of voters, me, especially me, they've completely alienated their, people that would vote for them now. It's pretty terrible, isn't it?
That's the thing, really. Labour's got to mobilise its voters, not Tory and Reform UK voters, because a lot of people, at the last general election, a lot of people didn't vote. A lot of people stayed at home. It was quite a low turnout, and Labour needs to mobilise people to vote for them because their vote was a lot, smaller than the previous two general elections, both in 2019 and 2017. So, I don't understand, but
it's just not going to work, is it? Getting the Reform, because people that vote for that will vote for them, right? They want the real deal. If you want fascist policies, you're going to vote for the fascists.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. Yeah, no one's going to vote Labour to be tough on deportations.
And so let's look at. I guess we've talked a lot about this, but Labour's at the moment trying to be really tough, and they've got their new borders bill, which I can't remember the name of now, but they have a new borders bill, and they're really trying to crack down on migration. You mentioned he's been flirting with Giorgia Meloni in Italy. She's offshoring refugees and asylum seekers, people on the move to Albania. Where do you think this is going to go with Labour? Do you think they're going to do that? Would you be surprised if they started to do a similar sort of program? It's not Rwanda anymore, but maybe it's somewhere else.
Yeah, it wouldn't surprise me if they did find somewhere else to offshore, asylum seeker, application processing. But I think in reality, it's not going to be an offshore asylum processing place. They're just going to be deported there, basically, and they're just going to stay there. I think that's what's really going on. Because if you look at what Giorgia Meloni did and what I think was discussed with Keir Starmer in his visit in September last year, she was talking about, where Italy offshores, people to Libya and basically refugees there. So refugees in the Mediterranean just sort of get, rounded up and turned back and sent to Libya. But they just face horrific human rights abuses in Libya. You've got really serious, torture and horrific things going on in Libyan prisons. So I just think, maybe it wouldn't be that bad in somewhere like Albania. But I think the real agenda is not to process applications. The real agenda is just to send them somewhere and leave them there.
Someone else's problem.
Yeah, exactly. And it's really it's horrifying because actually the vast majority of refugees in the world, they don't come to Europe, and a tiny portion that do come to Europe come to Britain. Like France will have many more asylum seeker applications than Britain does. People complain about refugees crossing the channel. Well, the vast majority actually do claim asylum in France. Mm-hmm. People want to cross the channel because, they speak English better than they do French or any other European language. English is very widely spoken in the world, or they've got family connections, and people have got a right to actually seek asylum and make an application in Britain. So yeah, I think that's what's sad. Actually, the burden of housing refugees falls on the poorest countries in the world, in Africa, Asia, the Middle East, other parts of the world. It's not Europe, it's not Britain, it's not the US.
Yeah, it's an absolute scapegoat, isn't it? Blaming migrants for everything that's wrong in a country. Like you said, the most refugees are in neighbouring countries.
That's right.
I think Lebanon has a huge refugee population. I'm not actually sure what it is, but it's those countries.
I think Lebanon is basic. Lebanon and Jordan, they're just basically big Palestinian refugee camps, essentially.
And like you said, the journey to get to Britain is absolutely horrific. Like in my journalism, I've done a lot of work with people crossing the Mediterranean or crossing the Channel, and it's absolutely horrific. And Libya is an unbelievable. The stuff that happens to people in Libya is outrageous.
Yeah.
And I think further punishing those people who've been through this are going to have PTSD and all kinds of issues. I think punishing them further by sending them to Rwanda or somewhere else is immensely cruel. And I don't understand why Labour thinks it's a good idea.
It really is, yeah. And there are so many people in Britain that don't agree with that. And that actually, I think most people are decent, because I think public opinion is, because I think that's what politicians say, and that's probably what Labour thinks. Oh, well, the polls show this and the polls show that, and public opinion says this and public opinion says that. But actually, public opinion only really reflects the rhetoric of politicians. If politicians are going on and on and on about, how terrible it is that asylum seekers are crossing the Channel in small boats, then public opinion is probably going to reflect that. But if you actually genuinely spoke to most people in the country and said, this person has fled war, and they've experienced real torture, persecution, a lot of their family have died, and, explained what people were fleeing and why they needed to seek asylum here, and said, do you think it, and then said, oh, do you think it's okay for them to seek asylum here? I think most people would say yes. Most people would compare that to, what the Jews went through. I know you can't, exactly compare that, but most people would kind of identify with, what happened to the Jews and why it's important to actually support people that are fleeing persecution. So I don't agree with that. And I think actually I think most people are actually quite decent, and it's just a shame that we don't really have political parties that are trying to appeal to those decent people that, want everyone to be better off and want to actually support, human rights for refugees.
Yeah, and I think that a big problem is politicians, like you said, talking about it all the time, and right-wing media making a big issue out of it. I just never have been able to understand how someone crossing the Channel in a rickety boat affects people's lives in the UK. It's obviously it has some kind of an effect, but I would say your rent, your boss, these kind of things have a much bigger impact on your life than someone from Nigeria or Libya or somewhere crossing the Channel.
Exactly. And also, things like, people don't realise that asylum seekers aren't actually allowed to work. You can only work legally in Britain once you've got so-called refugee status. And I don't think people know that. People don't know that actually it's government policy to not allow these people to work. Because I think most people would be sympathetic to letting asylum seekers come here and actually just go about the business and earn money and, pay taxes and national insurance like everyone else does. I think most people would be quite happy with that.
Yeah, I think so too. And one thing I sometimes say to people is if people come here and work, they might not stay here forever. If that's your thing, we must keep them out. Though they might not stay forever anyway. I've lived and worked abroad and I came home. People do that. And so, and obviously I don't care where, I like people coming here and stuff, but I say that to people. I don't know. Is that a good argument, do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. But also, I mean, I was thinking most people in Britain would like the right to work abroad if they wanted to. I don't think it would occur to people in Britain that actually there might be this big far-right fascist movement, that mainstream parties are conceding to, that would stop British people from going about their business and, working for a couple of years in a different country, I think most people would be horrified at that thought, So I think, people expect, themselves to have the right to pretty much do what they want to do, as long as they were earning an honest living and, paying their taxes and, doing what you're supposed to do. Most people in Britain would think, actually, I should be allowed to work abroad if I wanted to. Yeah. So I think we should do the same thing for others.
And so let's move on to the riots. So they and I think this ties in with what we've been talking about. There's been, I think one of the reasons the riots happened was because there was lots of conspiracy theories. People talk about the Great Replacement conspiracy theory, and that was what I went on an anti-fascist protest in Manchester, and some of the things you heard the people talking about were these conspiracy theories, and obviously I think there's a lot of it's to do with racism as well, but I think there were people caught up in those in those riots that maybe they've heard, because they're constantly told that people crossing the channel on a small boat is affecting their lives somehow. I don't know. What did you think about it all? What were the reasons do you think people got involved in those riots?
Well, I think you're right. I mean, definitely there were all sorts of conspiracy theories that were being, circulated online and that were doing the rounds, and that was very unhelpful. But I think the critical thing is he's Muslim, which wasn't true, and it was pretty shocking that actually there were disagreements in the state, amongst the CPS and the police about whether or not to actually publicly state that actually he wasn't Muslim. Because I think there was Al-Qaeda type materials found in his possession, but that doesn't mean you're Muslim. That just means you're interested in, a bit of weird stuff and causing trouble and, floating with the idea of, terrorism and so on. That doesn't mean you're Muslim. So he wasn't from a Muslim background. And it's a shame that people didn't clarify that. But also, even if he was Muslim, that doesn't make it okay to run riot and attack anyone that isn't white, and violently attack mosques and so on. So I think, basically there were two things. He's Muslim and he was a refugee that, crossed the channel on a small boat. It was those two things that I think were being whipped up and wound up. And that's what led to it. But I think you have to look at the wider context of it. I mean, I think all of us expected some sort of racist backlash to a Labour government, because you always see this. You always see the far right really stirring it up when there's a Labour government, which is why it's sad that Labour always concedes to this agenda, because they should really be, learning from history and standing up to it. But yeah, I think it was, literally within a month, within weeks, really, because this took place at the end of July. Yeah. The general election was beginning of July. I don't think I expected that, not that soon. But also, you had a Tommy Robinson demo in London that was quite big. There's about 15 to 20,000 people at that demo in central London, in Trafalgar Square. I think they felt emboldened. I think a lot of those people were at the core of stirring up the riots all over the country. I think that emboldened them, that encouraged them. So I think that had an impact. But also, I think on the day that the Axel Rudikabana carried out that horrific attack in Southport, I think on the same day is the Labour government basically cut winter fuel allowance. And I think, was it just a couple of weeks before or a week before, where they kept the 2-child benefit cap? So I think there's all, there was sort of disappointment in the Labour government not, actually delivering on the very core issues of living standards, and then just a very extreme sort of racist scapegoating reaction, basically, I think is what led to the riots. And obviously this is not something new. This is something that's been bubbling away for a very long time. And don't forget, you had Rishi Sunak, his key slogan was "Stop the boats," and you had people involved in the riots chanting that slogan, And let's not forget Suella Braverman, who, my God, I mean, she's to the right of Nigel Farage, I would, say. She openly embraces Tommy Robinson supporters, and I think, was it not for her, you may not even have seen the riots and the mobilisations for Tommy Robinson, because you hadn't heard from Tommy Robinson and his supporters, mobilising in a serious way in central London since, about 2018 or something. And then, all of a sudden she intervened attacking the Palestine demo in 2023 on Armistice Day, whipping up, these myths about, the cenotaph being under attack and so on. And she just, that whole whipping up of, the Palestine demo. Well, I think it did help to build the Palestine demo. So I think it might have backfired on that point of view. But it did put Tommy Robinson and fascist street movements back on the map, because they were running riot that day. In central London, and they wouldn't have been doing that if it wasn't for Suella Braverman. She really emboldened and galvanised that movement, and that's why we've been dealing with Tommy Robinson mobilisations over the last year. So I think the Tory government and their racist rhetoric, their stop the boats anti-refugee rhetoric, and their Islamophobia, because don't forget there was that massive ramping up of Islamophobia about a year ago. That's coincided with, the whole situation in Gaza and so on. So I think, it's been bubbling away for quite a long time. Then you had a Labour government, you had that horrific attack, you had some shocking policies being announced on the question of living standards by a Labour government, and it just went, pop.
Yeah, I think there was lots of things, right, that led to it. It's funny that you say Suella Braverman is to the right of Nigel Farage. I think I agree, actually, because you're right. I think the Tories for a while have been flirting with like far right conspiracy theories. They never talk about like the Great Replacement and all this crazy stuff, but they kind of mention it. Have you seen Kemi Badenoch? She's done the Tory party's had an advertisement recently on Twitter, and it was a picture of Kemi Badenoch, and it was like, only the Tories can defend Western civilization, or something along those lines. Like, what are you talking about?
Yeah, exactly.
Just, I'm worried that there's so much misinformation, particularly I think one of the reasons people get so angry about people crossing the channel in small boats is because they think that they are going to get put up in a 5-star hotel, get lots of money, while benefits and everything else is being cut for everyone else. And I think this just leads to this problem. It's really quite depressing.
Yeah, and they don't realise that actually that's government policy. They're not allowed to work. They're not allowed to find their own homes, and they'd all want to do that. Who wants to stay in a hotel? I mean, even the nicest hotel, you get fed up after a while, don't you?
I can't imagine the boredom that you must have if you're for several years in a hotel. You can't work, you can't do anything. You get really terrible food in some cases. And I think there's been reports of abuse in these hotels as well. It's pretty.
And it is, well, and worse than that, I think a lot of child asylum seekers have gone missing because of staying in hotels. Because I think they're targeted by, I do think criminal gangs do target vulnerable people, like women refugees and child refugees in particular. And I think, and it's government policy, because actually that leads to people feeling unsafe and being unsafe and subjected to, and they're just disappearing because they're not allowed to actually be in the system and live and work like everyone else does.
And it's one of the things we noticed about the riots is there was quite a lot of kids involved in there, and some of the riots were in like quite deprived areas, deprived parts of Liverpool and Hull and places like that. How do you think we can reach those people with an anti-racist message? How can we get through to them?
Well, I think there's two things. I think one, you really need a progressive political party or movement that actually champions making people better off, because I think without that you won't be able to defeat the far right and racism, because that is really a strong breeding ground for racist and fascist movements. But I think you can have a strong anti-racist campaign alongside that actually says, that's positive, that actually talks about the contribution that different cultures and communities have made to Britain. And also, I know a lot of people talked about it at the time, things like Rock Against Racism and, making anti-racism cool and racism very uncool. I think that sort of thing is quite important. Although I'm just not sure the bands these days are as cool as they were back then. Probably showing my age a bit there.
I think the same, but yeah, I think it's an age thing now. Bands aren't as good as they used to be.
Not as cool as they used to be. Yeah. But I think maybe musicians are probably to the right of where they were in the 70s. But I think footballers are to the left. If you think about the kind of anti-racism that's being championed by footballers, in terms of like if you're looking for like a sporting or cultural medium that anyone can relate to, I would say it's footballers that have done that in the last few years, championing anti-racism, fighting the Tory government on taking the knee. I mean, they were literally the people talking about the English football team as though they were like the official opposition, because they weren't getting much opposition from the Labour opposition at the time. And so you had I think that had a big impact, actually, because you even had a lot of, Tory MPs going, why are we attacking the English football team? I don't think taking the knee means they're supporting some sort of, Marxist Black Lives Matter movement.
And like Marcus Rashford, I think he's no longer at Manchester United. I'm showing my lack of football knowledge here, but he had a great campaign for like trying to get children to free school meals, wasn't it? It was brilliant, and I think he forced the government down. Right, Boris Johnson got in touch with him, and they had to back down because they looked ridiculous at the time. And they did such a better job than Starmer and the Labour leadership, I think, at that time.
Yeah, I agree. But I mean, I think that's exactly it, because I think that sort of thing does reach out to the majority of the population. We just need someone to show a bit of leadership to actually encourage that.
I like that. What you said, we need to make anti-racism cool, because I think particularly in the US, which we'll move on to in a minute, I think there seems to be like really conservative people or far right people seem to think they're punk rock. And they're like, they're standing up to people. They're standing up against the
anti-establishment.
Yeah, they're anti-establishment, and there couldn't be more establishment if you know anything about history, right? So how do we do it? Do you have any ideas how we make it cool? Bring cool musicians back again?
Yeah, exactly. But also, I think you really need leadership. You need, like, if you think about it, 20 years ago, you had people like Ken Livingstone, who's mayor of London. What did he do? So much money was being, poured into investing in London's diversity. And it was very important because you have to make it work. You've got to, because you've got so many different communities and cultures and different backgrounds, faith communities in London, and the only way it's going to work is if you like really champion, that it's a good thing. Sadiq Khan does do that, I think, but I think you had a lot more investment in like actual anti-racist policies. Like you had things like the Respect Festival or the Rise Festival, whatever what it was called, which did make anti-racism cool. You had various people headlining, like Public Enemy headlined that, and De La Soul and people like that, and they were huge, and they were really important. Things like that were very important, and I thought he showed tremendous leadership after the terrorist attack on 7/7, which was 20 years ago now, and so that's what it requires. You need that sort of leadership from the top, really.
We need De La Soul and Public Enemy back.
That's right, yeah. Exactly.
So let's move on to the US. So recently we've seen Elon Musk and Steve Bannon, who I think is like some far-right agitator, but he used to be Trump's like strategic advisor, and other people doing the Nazi salute, or the Roman salute, as they say sometimes. Do you worry, or do you think that this could ever, people here might start doing that? Like, some people who want to be edgy conservatives or edgy far-right people will be brave enough, I suppose, to do that here?
That's an interesting question, because I do think that obviously Elon Musk Nazi salute and Bannon doing, but I think particularly Elon Musk, because he's much more well known and he did it on Trump's inauguration where the whole world was watching. It obviously will lead to people feeling emboldened and fascists, doing that sort of thing and thinking it's actually okay. But I'm wondering if in Britain it actually backfired and didn't work so well, because if you remember the demonstration by Tommy Robinson supporters on the 1st of February was only like 10 days after Trump's inauguration. And we were really worried about, how big that demonstration would be, because they had about 25,000 people in October. So we thought, we were actually expecting, about the same or bigger demonstration. But actually it was considerably smaller. There was only about 5,000 of them. So that's quite a significant reduction in size. And I'm just wondering if, because Tommy Robinson has a kind of, broad support, if you like. It's not just like a hardcore kind of fascist or Nazi people. They're definitely there. But there are far-right elements that probably wouldn't describe themselves as fascists that mobilise for him. And I'm just wondering if those people that wouldn't describe themselves as fascist or Nazi, who would be tempted to go to Tommy Robinson demo, just thought, you know what? Elon Musk backs Tommy Robinson and he just did a Nazi salute. Because I think in Britain there's a big contradiction amongst British nationalists because of Winston Churchill and fighting the Nazis in the Second World War. It's a big contradiction if you're patriotic and you're British and you're a nationalist. Where do you stand on Churchill versus the Nazis? A lot of them feel a bit conflicted and don't like Nazi salutes, because I think foreign fascism doesn't work in Britain. Because I remember I'm just really showing my age in this podcast, about 21 years ago, I remember Nick Griffin, when he was leader of the British National Party, inviting Jean-Marie Le Pen, who was the leader of the Front National in France at the time. He invited him over to launch the BNP's European election campaign, and it totally backfired. All of the right-wing, I would say quite often racist newspapers were really condemning it, had a really strong anti-fascist line saying stop Le Nazi, with a big picture of Nick Griffin on it. It backfired really badly. So I'm just wondering if there is this contradiction amongst British fascists and far right supporters, where they think actually I'm not comfortable with Nazi salutes and that movement and being part of that. Yeah. So I'm wondering actually if it sort of didn't work in Britain.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that the far right in the UK seems to be so, the Second World War is so big for them, and respecting the soldiers, and you can't be giving respect to the people that killed British soldiers, can you? It's a total contradiction.
Yeah.
Yeah, so hopefully we won't see them doing that here. What do you think Trump's effect, and his general racist policies is going to have on Labour? And are you confident, or maybe confident's not the right word, do you think that Labour will stand up to this? Personally, I think they're going to capitulate big time. I wonder what you think.
Yeah, I agree. I don't think they're going to stand up to it. Because they're already quite weak on racism, immigration, asylum rights, and pressure from the United States. Yeah, they'll just cave, they'll just buckle. I mean, I'm wondering if you won't even see, the size of the demonstrations against Trump's state visit last time. I'd be surprised if you saw something, as big as that this time, because I think there might be pressure from the Labour government to, discourage Labour members and, maybe even some of the trade unions from mobilising.
Yeah, I think that would turn. I think that's going to be a big strategic mistake for Labour, for Starmer, inviting Trump over when he's I think people are so. Well, maybe there are people that support him, but a lot of people really dislike what he's doing and the effect that he's going to have on us, right?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, and from the point of view of racism, I mean, where do you start with the things that he's done, releasing, all those fascists, the Proud Boys and Oath Keepers? It's really quite shocking what he's done, and it's not really being covered in the same way as Trump's policies were being covered previously. There's just less of a shock factor.
And they're housing asylum seekers or people whose visas have run out in the States in Guantanamo Bay as well, which I just
Yeah.
cannot believe that. And it doesn't feel to me like there's enough backlash to that.
Yeah, there's not.
It's outrageous.
Yeah. Yeah, well, there's that. There's, detention centres in Guantanamo Bay, and also just ending the birthright of, people born in the US to have US citizenship, ending that. I mean, they're basically pushing the great replacement theory into national policy, is probably the best way of putting it, as well as these attacks on DEI, which is just a kind of like reverse Black Lives Matter, isn't it? I mean, you had, after the Black Lives Matter movement, you had companies falling over themselves to, have anti-racist type policies and, have some sort of measures that showed that they were taking the issue seriously. But then now there's a culture of, a more conservative approach to that sort of thing under Donald Trump. And I think lots of companies are breathing a huge sigh of relief now. So yeah, I mean, like the racist policies are just absolutely shocking. I mean, I was talking to someone earlier who said, the US is basically a fascist state now. If you look at what's going on, I'm not sure I would necessarily agree with that, but that's quite a big statement. And you must be doing something quite shocking and bad for people to be thinking, actually, this is fascism, or we're on the verge of fascism. So yeah, I think it is a shame that we're not seeing a Labour government that's standing up to this.
It would be great to just to see them do that. It'd be great for them to do lots of other things, but it would be so much better if they would stand up to him. And it's not just Labour, right?
Yeah.
The government here, it's lots of European governments don't seem to want to poke the beast, I suppose. Don't want to stand up to him, right?
Yeah.
One thing I've seen a lot of people talk about, and this is a big issue for the right, particularly in the US, they often talk about free speech and how important free speech is, which I agree with. But then what I often think is what far-right people mean when they talk about free speech is they want to be free from the consequences of free speech. They're not actually interested. Because I think Trump is he's closing lots of government buildings and they're cracking down on strikes. And I think he's talking about defunding some universities if there's left-wing protests on them. So they don't actually care about free speech at all. And there's lots of talk at the moment, I think, particularly online. I don't know if you've been following, but people have been talking about it's the end of woke, which I'm not really sure what I think about all of that kind of stuff anyway. But I wonder if you can talk about that, and then is there a way, what's the sort of, this is something I often think about, is how do we talk to people who might express kind of racist opinions, but they're not racist, like they're not fascist, they just have some of these, and how do we talk to them without alienating them?
I mean, I think, to be honest with you, you just have to tell the truth, because a lot of the racism that we hear is simply based on racist myths. Like asylum seekers live in hotels and don't want to work. Well, they're not allowed to work. They should be allowed to work. Most people probably don't know that. Why are people seeking asylum? What are they fleeing from? A lot of people who maybe, have racist views, but, are not part of any fascist movement or organisation, probably don't know what people are fleeing. They don't know about actually how the economy is dependent on immigration, and actually they'll be a lot worse off if you had fewer immigrants in Britain. I just think tell the truth. The problem is you've got so few people that are willing to tell it, in terms of political parties and movements with any very significant mass base.
Yeah, I think that's like something I'll say to people, like if they say something, I try not to say you're racist. I'll say, well, what you've said is kind of racist, and actually this is true. These are the facts, right? That's what I try to do when I confront that kind of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, if you're talking to Joe Bloggs, and if you're door knocking, if you're campaigning, in a general election, I wouldn't attack people and call them a racist, depending on what they said.
I mean, unless they are Nazi saluting.
Yeah. Or using the N-word or the P-word explicitly. Yeah, but if they just sort of had a view that was just constantly repeated by every politician from every political party, bar, with the exception of, a handful, they're often just repeating, myths that are in the mainstream, either in political parties or peddled in the media in some way. So you can't really blame people for having those views, because they just simply reflect the views that are kind of being spread constantly around them. So yeah, you just have to, I would agree with that. You can have a racist view and people can say racist things. It doesn't necessarily make them a racist, yeah.
Because I think, because our society can often be quite racist. The structural racism, it affects everyone, right? I think sometimes that just, people will say things without thinking it through. I'm not talking about fascists. I mean, they're obviously doing it because they don't care. But so I'm just talking about, Joe Blogs, like you said, on the street, talking to someone in the pub and this kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, I think people make mistakes, and I think you have to allow for people to correct that.
Absolutely.
And not just condemn them,
Tell us about the All Global Day of Action, which is on the 22nd of March.
Well, it's a bit different this year to previous years because we're having a big focus on campaigning against Reform UK.
Good idea.
In the local elections, but also building a base and a kind of movement against Reform UK nationally all over the country, even if there aren't elections taking place, because actually there won't be elections in most places because there's only metropolitan borough elections in Doncaster plus a mayor election. That's the big priority. Anyone's got a bit of spare time, go to Doncaster, campaign against Reform UK. And then there's a few mayoral elections, then there's county council elections, but most places don't have big local elections this year. But I think it is quite important to build a kind of anti-racist movement against Reform UK because they are really using the racism. I mean, obviously the living standards question is, a big part of, why you're in this situation where they're topping the polls and, if replicating a general election would mean they're the largest party in Parliament and potentially Farage as Prime Minister in a Reform UK Tory coalition. But they don't have any solutions on the living standards question. They're to the right of the Tories, and they're the most right wing on attacking living standards. So people aren't voting for them because they think they will be better off with them. They're voting for them because all they do is provide a scapegoat. They just scapegoat Muslims, refugees, and so on. And so, in the absence of actually anyone giving a solution to their problems and actually making them better off, people are going towards scapegoating. That's what you saw in Germany with the growth of the AfD. That's what you're seeing in America with support for the MAGA movement and Trump. And really it's the failure. And I think you see, I think Britain, Germany, the US are very similar because I think Olaf Scholz and the SPD, Starmer and Labour and the Democrats under Biden, they'd sort of done something similar. They're not really delivering anything on the question of living standards and making people better off, and then they're really conceding to the whole kind of anti-refugee, anti-immigrant agenda, which isn't working for them. It's really demobilising their vote because Donald Trump didn't get a bigger vote from the previous election. The Democrats just failed to mobilise 10 million votes that they got previously. It's quite a lot.
The Democrats are so bad, and obviously their support for the genocide in Gaza is just going to totally ruin their vote, right? And it's just,
Well, you've got to mobilise your base. You've got to mobilise your voters, and I think that's what those political parties get wrong. They're just too busy trying to compete with voters that actually won't vote for them anyway. You've got to mobilise your base, your voters. So I think actually building a movement against Reform UK and challenging their racism and their scapegoating of refugees and immigrants and challenging their Islamophobia is really important. So that's the focus. That's the big day of action this year. There's no big demo in central London, sadly. I was a bit sad about that. I like a big demo. They are. But I think it's the right thing to do. We've had lots of demos, actually, more than we would normally because of the big demonstrations against Tommy Robinson. And we did a good job on those. So I think it's right strategically to focus on campaigning against Reform UK. So that's what we're doing.
In Reform UK, obviously, I think you're right. I think it is a racist party. Its policies are racist and they scapegoat migrants. And I think basically what they want to do is cut the NHS, get rid of all the welfare state. But people might say, "Oh, Reform aren't racist. They have black members. They have Muslim members." I'm not sure they do actually. But they're not just white people. So how do you combat that? How would you combat that?
I mean, how do you combat that? I mean, Tommy Robinson's got, I would say Tommy Robinson's a fascist. There are people that are not white supporting Tommy Robinson. I think, there are stupid people. There are people, I don't know, who it might be in their self-interest in some way, shape or form to support the likes of Farage or Tommy Robinson. I'm not sure exactly what they're getting out of it. Maybe they've got a high-paid job. Maybe they feel like they've got some sort of, power or status by being involved in them. But if you look at the majority of, people in Britain, you don't have to do too much research to see that actually the vast majority of people who are not white, the vast majority of them vote Labour, and I think Labour takes that vote for granted.
Yes. Absolutely. And then, so before asking my last question, was there anything I should have asked you, Sabby, that I didn't ask you? Was there anything that you wanted to talk about in this interview that I've not asked you about?
No, definitely not. I thought you asked all the right questions.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, just to say, I think, it's very worrying times. I think we're changing epochs, I think, with the second Trump presidency, and then for the first time in British history, you're seeing a party to the right of the Conservative Party topping the poll. Very worrying. We've got to mobilise against this.
Yeah, definitely. I couldn't agree more. I think your Global Day of Action sounds really interesting. We'll have links to that, I think, in this YouTube video. And we'll obviously be promoting that in the Morning Star, I would assume. So can you just tell us, the last question, how can people watching or listening to this, how can they get involved in Stand Up to Racism? Where can they find out more?
Well, you can follow us on our website at www.standuptoracism.org.uk. You can follow us on, I want to say Twitter, but it's not called Twitter anymore. X handle is at Anti-Racism Day. We've got a Facebook page. We're on Instagram, Stand Up to Racism UK. We've got a YouTube channel as well. And I think, some of our online events have been posted on YouTube. I think it became a thing during lockdown and COVID a few years ago. You can join, you can become a member, and you can get active in your local group.
Great. Thank you very much, Sabby. It was really great to talk to you. So if you would like to find out more about the issues Sabby and I talked about, you can go to the Morning Star's website, which is morningstaronline.co.uk. We have a bunch of stuff on there on all these topics. And I think you've written for the paper several times as well, which is great. For more on everything we talked about, go to the Morning Star's website and become a subscriber, because independent media needs you.
I'm a subscriber.
Woo!